On the afternoon of May 17, 1985, a spring rain was falling on Kensington Palace Gardens in London when a cipher telegram arrived at the desk of a 47-year-old KGB intelligence officer named Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky. The building at 18 Kensington Palace Gardens, a cream-colored Victorian mansion set behind tall iron gates in one of London's most expensive residential streets, housed both the official functions of the Soviet diplomatic mission and the intelligence residency that operated, as was standard Cold War practice, within the protective shell of diplomatic cover. Gordievsky's fourth-floor office overlooked the garden at the rear of the building. On that May afternoon, the trees outside were in full early summer leaf, the kind of ordinary London spring afternoon that gave no outward indication of what was arriving by encrypted cable from Moscow Center. As the KGB's acting resident in the United Kingdom, the senior Soviet intelligence officer in Britain, Gordievsky received cipher communications from Moscow on a near-daily basis. Messages concerning personnel deployment, intelligence collection priorities, operational guidance, and administrative matters arrived and were processed as a routine element of professional life. He had received hundreds of such messages over 3 years in London. The routine of receiving, decoding, and acting on them had become unremarkable. He decoded this one himself, sitting at his desk in his shirt sleeves. It was brief. The telegram instructed him to return to Moscow immediately for consultations regarding the future operational direction of the residency. The stated reason offered no specifics, no indication of how long the consultations were expected to last, no explanation of which aspects of the residency's work required in-person discussion, and no mention of what had prompted this requirement at this particular moment. The phrasing was standard bureaucratic language, the kind that could be attached to any number of legitimate administrative requirements. But Gordievsky was not reading it in isolation. He was reading it as a man who had spent more than 2 decades inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus and who understood its protocols and deviations from those protocols with the intimacy of long professional familiarity. Senior KGB residents in major Western postings were not recalled to Moscow for vague, unspecified consultations. When such recalls occurred, they almost always signified one of 2 things: either a significant operational change requiring direct briefing or a problem with the officer himself. Nothing in recent operational traffic from Moscow Center suggested an imminent major change. According to his later memoir and the extensive post-exfiltration debriefing records compiled by British intelligence, Gordievsky set the telegram down on his desk, looked out at the rain-dampened garden below his window, and arrived at a conclusion with the systematic precision that 11 years of operating as a double agent had built into him. He had been betrayed. He did not yet know by whom. He did not know what specific evidence the KGB held or how advanced their case against him was. But the telegram, with its studied vagueness and its departure from established communication protocols, told him enough. What the telegram could not communicate, and what Gordievsky could not fully articulate as he sat in that fourth-floor office on a wet London afternoon, was the weight of what his potential exposure represented beyond himself. For 11 years, while rising steadily through the ranks of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, he had been systematically providing the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, with a comprehensive inside picture of Soviet intelligence operations across the Western world. The consequences of that work, now threatened by whatever had prompted that telegram, would extend far beyond the career of one intelligence officer. More than 200 Soviet intelligence personnel operating across the NATO alliance would eventually be identified, expelled, and neutralized as a direct result of what Gordievsky had built and sustained over the preceding decade. The operation now in danger of unraveling was, as senior figures in British intelligence would later assess, the most valuable human intelligence relationship the Western alliance had developed against the Soviet Union during the entire Cold War. If you follow the documented history of Cold War intelligence and the real human costs behind these operations, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. These cases, the ones the history books leave incomplete, are what we cover every week. Now, back to Oleg Gordievsky and how it all began. To understand how a KGB officer had spent more than a decade systematically providing intelligence against his own organization, and why the consequences of that relationship would eventually reshape Soviet foreign intelligence operations across the entire Western world, it is necessary to begin considerably earlier, with a childhood spent at the center of the Soviet security state, and with a young man's long, careful journey from sincere ideological commitment to irrevocable and ultimately consequential doubt. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky was born on February 10th, 1938, in Moscow, into circumstances that placed him from birth within the operational world of the Soviet security apparatus. His father, Anton Lavrentievich Gordievsky, had joined the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the predecessor organization to what would become the KGB, during the 1930s, and had remained within the Soviet security services throughout his career. Gordievsky's older brother, Vasily, would also join the KGB as an adult. The Gordievsky family was, in practical terms, an intelligence family across two generations, shaped by the institution, defined by its priorities, and insulated from certain deprivations of Soviet life by the material advantages that proximity to the security services provided. Growing up in wartime and post-war Moscow, Gordievsky came of age in a city that understood itself to be at the center of a civilizational contest. He was 3 years old when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and his earliest coherent memories were formed against the backdrop of wartime conditions, the evacuations, the rationing, the particular psychology of a city that knew the outcome of the conflict might determine whether the Soviet state survived at all. He grew up in an apartment in a building that housed the families of other security apparatus personnel, neighbors whose professional lives ran along the same channels as his father's, whose children attended the same schools, who shared the particular social world that the Soviet security services maintained for those within their orbit. The family's connection to the NKVD and its successor organizations meant they occupied housing that was better than average by Soviet standards and had access to a slightly wider material world than that available to ordinary Soviet citizens. It also meant growing up with an unsentimental, intimate familiarity with the surveillance culture the security apparatus maintained over Soviet society. In the Gordievsky household, the instruments of state power were not an abstraction, they were the family profession. Stalin's death in 1953, which produced waves of uncertainty throughout Soviet society, and particularly within the security services, was an event the 15-year-old Gordievsky would have observed filtered through the anxiety of people whose institutional world was being reassessed. He graduated from secondary school in 1956 and enrolled at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, the premier training institution for Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers. Admission required connections, strong academic standing, and demonstrated ideological reliability. The student body was drawn predominantly from the families of the Soviet professional and political elite, and the atmosphere of the institution reflected its function, producing the people who would represent the Soviet state in its most demanding foreign environments. Gordievsky's studies there, covering international relations and languages, gave him proficiency in German, Danish, and English, a linguistic range that would prove operationally significant throughout his career, and positioned him for the work the KGB's foreign intelligence apparatus required of officers operating abroad. He graduated in 1961 into a Cold War that had recently become considerably more dangerous, with the construction of the Berlin Wall in August of that year, marking a new phase in the division of Europe. By his own subsequent account, rendered in both his post-exfiltration debriefings and in his memoir published after the Cold War, Gordievsky was during these years a committed and sincere young communist. This characterization is important because it is frequently misread in retrospect. The man who would eventually commit to one of the most sustained intelligence operations in Cold War history against the Soviet state did not begin his adult life as a dissenter operating in disguise. He began it as a genuine believer in the system he had been raised inside, a product of an environment, family, school, institution, that had consistently reinforced the correctness and necessity of the Soviet project. The distance between that belief and what he eventually became was covered slowly over many years under the pressure of specific events that he could not rationalize away. In 1961, Gordievsky joined the KGB's first chief directorate, the division responsible for foreign intelligence collection and operations outside Soviet borders. His first extended foreign posting, following training and internal orientation, took him to East Berlin in the early to mid-1960s. The city was in the immediate aftermath of the Berlin Wall's construction, a site of constant geopolitical friction and one of the most heavily surveilled environments in Europe, where the intelligence services of multiple nations operated in close proximity in a divided urban landscape. Working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet mission, Gordievsky received the foundational operational experience of conducting intelligence work in an environment where errors had immediate and severe consequences and where professional standards were exacting. His first Copenhagen posting came in 1966. Denmark, a founding NATO member occupying a strategically significant position in Northern Europe, with coastline on the Baltic approaches, a variety of NATO-aligned defense and research establishments, and a diplomatic community that included personnel from across the Western Alliance, was a consequential collection target for Soviet intelligence. Gordievsky was assigned to the Soviet embassy under standard diplomatic cover, with official duties as a cultural attaché that bore no resemblance to his actual responsibilities, which included recruitment operations, intelligence collection, and the management of the residency's ongoing work across Scandinavia. He lived in Copenhagen as any Soviet diplomat of his rank would have lived, attending social functions, maintaining the appearance of a man whose professional interests were cultural exchange, and filing reports with the embassy that satisfied the requirements of his cover. It was during this Copenhagen posting that he met and married Yelena Akopian in 1968, known within the family as Layla. She was a woman with her own connection to the Soviet diplomatic world through family background, educated, capable in languages, and accustomed to the particular rhythms of life as a Soviet citizen abroad. By all subsequent accounts from people who knew the couple during these years, she was entirely unaware of the dimensions of her husband's professional life that fell outside his official KGB cover. She would spend the next 17 years building a marriage and raising 2 daughters alongside a man who was simultaneously maintaining a clandestine relationship with British intelligence that she had no knowledge of and no reason to suspect. The person she believed she was married to and the person she was actually married to were, in a fundamental sense, not the same. The event that Gordievsky would later identify in his debriefings, in interviews with researchers, and in his memoir as the beginning of his disillusionment occurred in August 1968, when Soviet and Warsaw Pact military forces invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the reform movement known as the Prague Spring. The government under Alexander Dubček had, over the preceding months, implemented a series of measured reforms within the communist framework, expanding press freedom, permitting broader political debate, allowing citizens wider latitude in professional and intellectual life. The Soviet leadership under Leonid Brezhnev had watched these developments with increasing alarm, interpreting them as a threat to the ideological coherence of the Warsaw Pact and to the principle, fundamental to Soviet security doctrine, that Eastern European states did not make fundamental political departures without Soviet approval. On the night of August 20th into August 21st, 1968, more than 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops and approximately 2,000 tanks crossed into Czechoslovakia. The reform movement was suppressed. Dubček was eventually removed. The experiment in what its architects had called socialism with a human face was ended by military force. Gordievsky was stationed in Copenhagen when the invasion occurred. As a KGB officer, he received the official Soviet communications framing the intervention as a defensive necessity, a protection of socialist stability against counter-revolutionary pressures financed from abroad. He understood the internal logic being deployed because he had spent his professional life inside the institution that generated it. What he could not do, according to his later accounts and the assessments derived from his extensive post-exfiltration debriefings, was resolve the contradiction between that logic and what the invasion revealed in practice. A state that sent armored vehicles into the streets of a neighboring capital because that capital had begun experimenting with intellectual freedom was not, on sustained reflection, a state whose account of itself could be accepted at face value. That realization, once arrived at, proved impossible to set aside. The journey from that realization to active cooperation with Western intelligence took approximately 6 years. Gordievsky was not impulsive. He was a professional who had been trained to assess situations carefully before committing to action, and he applied that discipline to his private reasoning with the same rigor he applied it to his operational work. He continued his KGB duties, performed them to the standard his superiors expected, and worked through the moral and practical implications of what he was considering. The question was not simply whether the Soviet system had revealed something troubling about itself in Czechoslovakia. The question was what he was prepared to do about it and what consequences he was prepared to accept. By the early 1970s, that process had reached a conclusion he was prepared to act on. By 1973, Gordievsky had returned from his first Copenhagen posting, completed further training in Moscow, and been reposted to Denmark, this time to a position giving him broader access within the Residency's intelligence operations across Scandinavia. He was 35 years old, more than a decade into his KGB career, and regarded by his superiors as a reliable officer whose professional record showed no indication of internal doubt. Nothing in his conduct or his performance had given his colleagues or superiors any reason to suspect what he was privately working toward. The mechanics of his recruitment by British intelligence remain partially classified, but the broad outline has been established through declassified documents, accounts from retired intelligence officers, and Gordievsky's own memoir and public statements. British intelligence had identified him as a potential recruitment target through his activities in Copenhagen. A KGB officer of his seniority and access, stationed in a NATO capital, represented a significant intelligence opportunity. Initial contacts appeared to have been made through carefully managed approaches that allowed Gordievsky to determine for himself how far he was prepared to go, while making clear that the British understood precisely what they were dealing with. The development of the relationship was gradual, measured, and driven significantly by Gordievsky's own pace. The formal agreement to cooperate with MI6, to provide systematic intelligence about KGB operations, personnel, and institutional assessments, was reached in the autumn of 1974. Gordievsky was 36 years old. He had spent 6 years working through the moral and practical implications of the decision he was now making. Declassified British intelligence records describe him, in the clinical assessment language that intelligence services apply to their human sources, as a volunteer, meaning that his approach to British intelligence was substantially self-initiated, rather than the product of aggressive external recruitment. He had arrived at this decision on his own terms, through his own reasoning, over his own timeline. There was no coercion, no compromising material held over him, no financial inducement that would have been primary. He had decided, on grounds that were fundamentally ideological and moral, that what the Soviet state was doing in the world was something he was no longer prepared to serve uncritically. What British intelligence received in the autumn of 1974 was not simply one more source within the Soviet system. They received the beginning of what would eventually be described by senior MI6 officers as the most valuable human intelligence relationship the Western alliance maintained against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The reason that assessment would eventually become justified was not what Gordievsky could provide in 1974, but what he would be positioned to provide as his career within the KGB continued to advance. And it would continue to advance for the next 11 years, with his handlers in British intelligence watching that advancement and understanding that the intelligence relationship they had built was becoming more consequential with each promotion. For the next 4 years, until his second Copenhagen posting ended in 1978, Gordievsky maintained a functional existence that required sustaining 2 entirely separate professional identities simultaneously. As a KGB officer, He was responsible for recruitment operations, intelligence collection, and the management of the Soviet embassy's intelligence apparatus in Scandinavia. He submitted operational reports, participated in the institutional life of the residency, and advanced his career through normal channels. As a British agent, he was meeting periodically with MI6 handlers at locations selected with elaborate attention to counter-surveillance, using meeting protocols that had been developed to minimize any risk of KGB detection. The intelligence he provided fell into several broad categories: the identities and roles of KGB officers operating in Scandinavia under diplomatic cover, the structure and priorities of Soviet intelligence operations targeting NATO countries, assessments of Soviet political and military thinking as reflected in communications from Moscow Center, and detailed information about the methods, communication protocols, and tradecraft the KGB used to recruit and manage its own assets in the West. Each piece of information individually was a fragment. Assembled over months and years, it constitutes something considerably more significant. In 1978, his second Copenhagen posting ended and he returned to Moscow, where he spent several years working at KGB headquarters in training and analytical functions. This period at the center of the Soviet intelligence bureaucracy, inside the building on Lubyanka Square, where the organization's most sensitive work was planned and assessed, gave him access to a qualitatively different category of information, not the operational specifics of a single regional posting, but the strategic priorities, personnel decisions, institutional debates, and threat assessments of the KGB's foreign intelligence apparatus as seen from its apex. He continued providing this intelligence to MI6 through contacts that, in Moscow, required operational security of a more demanding order than had been necessary in Copenhagen. The risk was substantially higher. The potential consequences of detection in Moscow were more immediate and more severe. He managed it. In 1982, the KGB posted Gordievsky to London as a senior officer in the residency at the Soviet embassy on Kensington Palace Gardens. He arrived with Layla and their two daughters, Maria, known within the family as Masha, who was approximately 10 years old, and Anna, who was approximately 7. The family occupied an apartment in a building housing other embassy staff. The daughters attended school in London, navigating the particular social world of children from Soviet diplomatic families in a Western capital. Competent in English, aware of the social boundaries their background imposed, ordinary in the ways that children are ordinary regardless of what their parents are. Layla, whose English was adequate for daily life, managed the household, maintained the social relationships that Soviet diplomatic spouses were expected to maintain, and built the routines of family life in London. To the neighbors, the diplomatic community, and the British officials whose professional lives intersected with the Soviet embassy, the Gordievsky household appeared entirely conventional. Inside the embassy, Gordievsky served first as deputy KGB resident and eventually as acting resident, following changes in the station's leadership. As acting resident, he was the most senior Soviet intelligence officer in Britain. The intelligence he was now providing to MI6 through meetings conducted at locations chosen with meticulous attention to counter-surveillance, using routes and timings designed to detect and avoid KGB observation, was of a fundamentally different order than what had been possible from Copenhagen or even from Moscow headquarters. As acting resident, he had access not limited to the London residency's operations. He had visibility into communications with Moscow Center that spanned KGB activities across Western Europe and beyond. He was not providing intelligence about one station. He was providing a view from the top of the entire apparatus, and he was doing it from the most consequential Soviet intelligence posting in the Western world. Several specific contributions from the London years have been at least partially documented through declassified government records and post-Cold War intelligence assessments. In 1983, Gordievsky provided MI6 with extensive information about a KGB intelligence collection program known by the Russian acronym RYAN, Raketno-Yadernoi Napadenie, meaning nuclear missile attack. The RYAN program was a sustained and institutionally significant operation tasked with detecting signs that the United States and its NATO allies were preparing a surprise nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. According to post-exfiltration debriefing records, Gordievsky described the program in considerable operational detail, including the specific indicators Soviet intelligence officers in Western capitals had been instructed to watch for as potential signals of imminent attack, ranging from unusual activity levels at government buildings during night hours to changes in the purchasing patterns of blood banks and the movements of senior government personnel. Ryan was not a marginal or peripheral KGB program. It reflected a genuine and deeply felt anxiety at the highest levels of Soviet leadership about American military intentions. The picture that emerged from this intelligence alarmed British and American analysts. The Soviet leadership's level of anxiety about the possibility of a Western nuclear first strike was substantially higher than Western governments had understood. The Soviet system was, in some critical respects, operating under a threat perception that had no grounding in actual Western intentions, but that was real enough to the decision-makers responding to it that it created genuine risk. A system watching intently for indicators of attack might, under certain conditions, misread a non-threatening event as evidence of exactly what it feared. This became directly relevant in November 1983, when NATO conducted a large-scale command post exercise called Able Archer 83, which simulated the escalation from conventional to nuclear war through realistic command procedures, including realistic communications protocols and the practice of procedures that would be used in an actual nuclear release sequence. Soviet intelligence services, primed by Ryan to watch for exactly such indicators, assessed certain features of the exercise as potentially consistent with actual war preparations rather than a simulation. According to declassified British government documents released in the 1990s, the intelligence Gordievsky had provided about Soviet threat perceptions informed decisions by the British government to share reassuring communications with Moscow through back channels during the exercise period, an attempt to reduce the risk that Soviet anxiety about the exercise might translate into something more dangerous. The extent to which this materially reduced risk during what some analysts have characterized as a genuinely tense period remains a subject of historical debate, but the British government's internal assessments credited Gordievsky's intelligence as having been significant in shaping the response. In 1984, intelligence that Gordievsky provided contributed directly to the identification and arrest of Michael Bettany, a British MI5 officer who had attempted to offer his services to the KGB, delivering unsolicited packages to the Soviet embassy containing classified British intelligence. Bettany had acted unilaterally without being approached, and the KGB resident to whom he had directed his approach had reported the contact to Moscow Center. Uncertain what to make of an unsolicited approach from a Western intelligence officer and cautious about the possibility that it might be a provocation, Moscow Center's communications about how to respond to the Bettany contact had passed through channels Gordievsky had access to. The intelligence he provided allowed MI5 to identify and arrest Bettany before the KGB could determine whether to recruit him. Bettany was tried and convicted in 1984 and received a sentence of 23 years. These documented contributions represented only the visible surface of what 11 years of systematic reporting from within the KGB's foreign intelligence apparatus had produced. The complete intelligence picture, the thousands of individual pieces of information about personnel, operations, methods, and institutional assessments that Gordievsky had accumulated and transmitted, was something British intelligence analysts were still fully processing when the ciphered telegram arrived in London on May 17, 1985, and the 11-year operation entered its most dangerous phase. Gordievsky arrived in Moscow on May 19, 1985, traveling on his Soviet diplomatic passport in the manner of any senior KGB officer returning temporarily to headquarters. He was 47 years old. He had spent 3 years in London. He understood, as he had understood since reading the telegram 2 days earlier, that what was waiting for him in Moscow was not a professional consultation. The KGB's approach to suspected traitors within its own ranks was methodical and institutionally deliberate. A direct confrontation and arrest of a senior officer in London would have created diplomatic complications and, more importantly, would have exposed the extent and source of the KGB's knowledge that once exposed could be traced back to whoever had provided it, and thereby eliminate a potentially continuing intelligence advantage. Instead, the Counterintelligence Directorate appears to have pursued a strategy of bringing Gordievsky home under the cover of normalcy and subjecting him to systematic interrogation procedures designed either to produce a confession or to gather sufficient additional evidence to justify formal prosecution without revealing the original source. In Moscow, Gordievsky was met at the airport by KGB colleagues who behaved entirely normally. He was taken to meetings at KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square. He was treated on the surface as a senior officer returned for professional discussions. The normal bureaucratic routines of a headquarters visit unfolded around him while simultaneously the counterintelligence machinery was being brought to bear. According to his memoir and the assessments compiled from his post-exfiltration debriefings, he was subjected to a drug-assisted interrogation during the weeks following his return. The specific compounds used by Soviet counterintelligence in such sessions were not publicly documented at the time, but the general practice of using pharmacological agents to reduce psychological resistance and encourage disclosure was a documented element of KGB counterintelligence methodology. Gordievsky described the sessions as producing states of confusion and cognitive impairment, with trained interlocutors pressing him systematically on the details of his contacts, his movements in London, and any activities that might be inconsistent with his official KGB responsibilities. He felt, he later wrote, as though his thoughts were being pulled in directions he could not fully control. He did not confess, whether this reflected the specific substances used, the psychological disciplines he had developed over more than a decade of operational double life, or both. The sessions did not produce the clear admission of guilt that the counterintelligence process required. What they produced was an ambiguous result, sufficient suspicion to prevent him from returning to London, but not definitive evidence sufficient to arrest and prosecute a senior officer without either a significant risk of institutional error or the need to reveal the source of the original suspicion in a way that might compromise that source's continuing utility. Gordievsky was assigned to training duties that kept him in Moscow, placed under surveillance, and denied permission to travel abroad. He went through the daily routines of a KGB officer performing unremarkable internal functions while understanding that the situation was not sustainable and that the margin between his current suspended state and formal arrest was narrower than it appeared. He spent the summer of 1985 in Moscow, taking the metro to KGB facilities each morning, eating lunch in canteens with colleagues who either did not know about or were not acknowledging the investigation being built around him, returning to his apartment each evening, and working through the question of whether and how he could activate the emergency plan that British intelligence had prepared for exactly this moment. The source of the KGB's suspicion was Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA officer working in the agency's Soviet counterintelligence division who had begun providing intelligence to Soviet handlers in April 1985, approximately 1 month before Gordievsky's recall to Moscow. Ames had access to the identities of CIA assets within the Soviet intelligence apparatus and, critically, to intelligence that had been shared with the CIA by allied services including MI6. The information he provided to the KGB in April 1985 included Gordievsky's identity as a British-run source. According to CIA damage assessments compiled following Ames's eventual arrest, his betrayals contributed directly to the deaths of at least 10 individuals who had been providing intelligence to Western services from inside the Soviet system, along with the imprisonment of others and the disruption of operations that in some cases had taken years to build. Ames would not be arrested until February 1994. In the weeks following his return to Moscow, Gordievsky managed to communicate to British intelligence that he was in danger and that the emergency exfiltration plan needed to be activated. The precise methods by which he communicated this remain classified. What is documented is that British intelligence had prepared for this contingency years in advance, An emergency exfiltration protocol, codenamed PIMLICO, had been developed, rehearsed, and maintained in readiness during the years of Gordievsky's active service. Every detail of it had been worked out with the assumption that there might eventually be a moment when Gordievsky needed to leave Moscow on short notice and that the normal channels through which intelligence was passed would not be available. The plan required Gordievsky to activate a prearranged signal on a specific day at a specific location in Moscow. According to his memoir, the signal involved his appearing on a stretch of Kutuzovsky Prospect, one of Moscow's broad central thoroughfares, a wide avenue of Soviet-era buildings and light traffic, at a prearranged time on a prearranged day, carrying a Harrods shopping bag, the distinctive dark green carrier from the London department store that was visually incongruous in a Moscow street in 1985, while eating a specific food item as a confirming secondary signal. The combination of location, timing, specific item carried, and specific behavior would be recognizable to MI6 contacts positioned in the area whose job was to watch for exactly this combination. If the signal was transmitted and received, the next phase of the operation would begin. On the morning of July the 19th, 1985, a Saturday, Gordievsky made his way to Kutuzovsky Prospect. He was dressed in ordinary street clothes, carrying the Harrods bag, appearing to any casual observer as an unremarkable middle-aged man moving through a Moscow street on a summer morning. According to accounts compiled from his debriefings and from individuals who participated in the operation, a British intelligence contact passed him at the agreed location and made brief confirming eye contact. The signal had been received. PIMLICO was activated. What followed required Gordievsky to leave Moscow and reach a meeting point outside the city without alerting the surveillance apparatus that was monitoring his activities. He managed to do so. The specific means by which he created sufficient space from his watchers are not fully documented in publicly available accounts. He reached the prearranged meeting point outside Moscow, where a British diplomatic vehicle carrying embassy personnel was waiting for him. The car was driven by British diplomats who were operating entirely within their legitimate diplomatic role while simultaneously executing an intelligence exfiltration. He climbed into the boot of the vehicle, the locked trunk of a British embassy car, and the car began its drive north through the Russian countryside in the summer heat through Leningrad and toward the Finnish border. The journey lasted many hours. The roads between Moscow and Leningrad passed through flat, forested Russian countryside, birch trees, small towns, the occasional industrial installation. Inside the boot of the car, Gordievsky was in a confined, dark space in summer temperatures, aware that the next several hours would determine whether he lived or spent the remainder of his life in a Soviet prison. At various points along the route, according to accounts from participants partially disclosed in subsequent years, the team made stops designed to appear unremarkable to any surveillance vehicle following the diplomatic car. In Leningrad, where the car halted before proceeding to the border, the intelligence personnel took measures to manage any trace of Gordievsky's presence that Soviet scanning equipment at the Vyborg crossing might detect. The Vyborg border crossing between the Soviet Union and Finland was the final and most dangerous phase of the operation. Soviet border guards processed British diplomatic vehicles through procedures that included documentation checks, visual inspection of the vehicle, examination of the undercarriage with mirrors, and the use of trained dogs whose effectiveness at detecting concealed persons was well established. Diplomatic conventions imposed constraints on the thoroughness of those inspections, but those constraints were not absolute. The decision about how carefully to search a given vehicle rested with the guards on duty, and the KGB had the authority to instruct border personnel to increase scrutiny of specific vehicles if it chose to do so. The car was processed through the checkpoint. The border guards conducted their inspection. The dogs were brought around the vehicle. The car crossed the border on July the 20th, 1985. On the Finnish side of the crossing, Oleg Gordievsky emerged from the trunk of a British embassy car, alive, free, and outside the jurisdiction of the organization he had spent 11 years working against from within. He was 47 years old. His wife and 2 daughters were in Moscow. They did not know what had happened or where he was. Gordievsky was transported to the United Kingdom and delivered to a secure location where British intelligence began one of the most extensive debriefing operations of the Cold War period. Teams of analysts and intelligence officers worked with him systematically over the following months, drawing out the full scope of what 11 years of access to the KGB's foreign intelligence apparatus had given him knowledge of. The sessions were long and methodical, organized to move through the different areas of his knowledge systematically. The personnel he had known, the operations he had been aware of, the communications he had seen, the assessments Moscow Center had made, the assets and methods and protocols that constitute the operational architecture of Soviet foreign intelligence in the Western world. His memory, a professional tool he had cultivated across his entire career, proved reliable in the depth and specificity it could provide. The intelligence assembled from those debriefing sessions, combined with the reporting he had transmitted during his active years as a British agent, gave Western intelligence services something that had not previously existed: a near-comprehensive map of KGB human intelligence operations across the Western world. It identified by name, role, and location the Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in NATO countries and their allies. It identified the methods those officers used, the assets they had in some cases recruited, the communication protocols they employed, and the assessments they had reported to Moscow Center. In a smaller number of cases, it identified Western nationals, citizens of NATO countries, who had been recruited as Soviet agents and were operating within their own governments, defense industries, and research institutions without the knowledge of the services that were supposed to protect those institutions. The British government moved quickly. On September 12, 1985, less than 2 months after Gordievsky's crossing into Finland, the British Foreign Office summoned the Soviet ambassador and presented him with a formal diplomatic note. 25 Soviet intelligence officers operating under cover at the Soviet embassy, the Soviet trade delegation, and other official Soviet establishments in the United Kingdom were declared persona non grata and given 7 days to leave the country. The diplomatic note specified no reasons beyond the standard formula, indicating that the named individuals were no longer welcome on British territory. Protocol did not require reasons, but the Soviet government understood immediately what the list signified. A source of extraordinary access and duration had been operating at the center of KGB operations in London, and that source had now been exfiltrated and debriefed. The Soviet response was the one available within the conventions of diplomatic relations: a retaliatory expulsion of 25 British officials and diplomatic personnel from the Soviet Union. The mutual expulsions made September 1985 one of the most significant months of Cold War intelligence activity in the decade. But those 25 Soviet officers expelled from the United Kingdom were only the most immediate and visible consequence of what Gordievsky's intelligence had made possible. British intelligence shared the relevant portions of his reporting with Allied services across Western Europe and North America through established intelligence sharing arrangements. West Germany received information pertaining to KGB operations on its territory. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, and other Allied nations received material identifying Soviet intelligence officers operating within their borders. Each service began its own process of investigating, assessing, and ultimately acting on the intelligence it had received. Some of those actions produced further formal expulsions. Others produced quieter outcomes, officers whose cover was now known being left in place, but rendered operationally useless, assets who had been recruited by those officers being identified and approached by Western counterintelligence agent networks that had taken years to construct being dismantled from their foundations. The cumulative result, compiled across multiple countries over the months following the initial British expulsions, was a total of more than 200 Soviet intelligence personnel across the Western world whose activities had been compromised, curtailed, or terminated. The 25 immediate UK expulsions, followed by waves of Allied action across Western Europe that continued through late 1985 and into 1986, each nation acting on the specific intelligence relevant to operations on its own territory. For the KGB's first Chief Directorate, The exposure represented a generational setback in operational capacity across the Western theater, not an irreversible one because intelligence services adapt and reconstitute, but genuine and significant at a moment when the geopolitical competition between the Soviet Union and the Western Alliance was in one of its most intensive phases. Oleg Gordievsky learned that her husband had disappeared in the days immediately following the exfiltration, when KGB officers arrived at the apartment she shared with her daughters in Moscow. They informed her that Oleg had defected to British intelligence, had been, as the KGB characterized it, a traitor to the Soviet Union for more than a decade. Whatever her private reaction was in those first hours, the accounts she subsequently gave to journalists and researchers in the years after the family eventually left the Soviet Union describe a state of complete disbelief that gradually gave way to something more complex and more permanent. She had not known. She had not suspected. She had been married to this man for 17 years, had followed him through postings in Copenhagen and London, had built a domestic life around his professional schedule, had raised 2 children in the rhythms of his career. The specific events, the meetings he had attended, the information he had transmitted, the relationships he had maintained with the British intelligence personnel in cities she had lived in alongside him, had taken place within the same physical world she had occupied, and she had had no access to any of it. Assessments compiled both by British intelligence following her eventual arrival in the United Kingdom and by the KGB's own investigation concluded the same thing. Layla had not been witting to her husband's activities. She was not an accomplice. She was a woman who had been married to a man she did not fully know, in the most consequential sense of that phrase. The KGB subjected her to sustained interrogation over the weeks and months following the exfiltration. She was questioned repeatedly about Oleg's contacts, his travel, his behavior at home, any anomalies she might have observed and not connected to anything at the time. She could provide little that was operationally useful because she had genuinely not known. She was removed from her employment. The social world of the Soviet diplomatic and intelligence community, the world in which she had lived as a KGB officer's wife, closed around her as colleagues and acquaintances, distanced themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who understood what association with a disgraced family meant in that environment. The apartment she shared with her daughters, formerly an unremarkable element of embassy housing, became a place defined by who was no longer there and by the nature of his absence. What the family was not permitted to do was leave the Soviet Union. Exit visas were denied. Applications to travel abroad were not processed. Layla and her daughters were held in a country that had turned on them without the ability to leave, and without any clear indication of when or whether that would change. They were not imprisoned. They were not physically harmed. But the state's ability to confine people within its borders without formal imprisonment was one of the most effective instruments of the Soviet system, and it was being applied to them fully. Maria was 13 years old when her father disappeared. Anna was approximately 10. Both girls were old enough to understand that something serious had happened, but young enough that the full dimensions of what their father had done and what the consequences would be exceeded what they were equipped to process. The initial period, the KGB officers arriving, the interrogations of their mother, the disruption of everything that had been routine, must have been experienced by 2 children whose understanding was still forming, as a collapse without explanation. Maria turned 14 in 1986, 15 in 1987, 16 in 1988. She sat the examinations that Soviet students sat, received the grades that reflected whatever reserves of concentration she could maintain in circumstances that were not ordinary, and moved through the academic and social stages of adolescence in a Moscow where her family's position had been fundamentally altered. She had been, before May 1985, the daughter of a senior Soviet diplomat. After May 1985, she was the daughter of a traitor, and in a society that held families accountable for the political failures of their members, that distinction was not abstract. Anna, 3 years younger, followed the same trajectory with the particular difficulty of having been even younger when it began. She was 10 when her father vanished, 13 when she entered secondary school, and 16 when the Soviet Union finally collapsed and the possibility of leaving began, for the first time, to materialize as something other than a remote hope. Contact between Gordievsky and his daughters during these 6 years was minimal and mediated. Letters passed through monitored channels, with both sides presumably aware that every word was being read. Occasional brief telephone calls were permitted, with the same awareness. The relationship between a father established in a British safe house and two daughters, living with the consequences of his disappearance, was sustained across 6 years of enforced distance by correspondence and intermittent contact that could not substitute for presence, and that could not carry the weight of what needed to be communicated. What those letters said is not fully documented in publicly available sources. What is documented is the duration of the separation, 1985 to 1991, and the ages at which it was lived. Gordievsky, established in the United Kingdom and working through his debriefing and subsequent public role as an intelligence commentator, was aware of his family's situation and unable to remedy it directly. He gave interviews to Western journalists, spoke publicly about his daughter's and wife's circumstances, and worked through British government channels to maintain diplomatic pressure on the Soviet government over the question of their freedom to leave. The British government raised the matter through official diplomatic channels. Human rights organizations took up the case. Western journalists reported on it. None of it produced results on any rapid timeline. The Soviet government had a limited range of responses available to a situation of this kind, and denying exit visas was one of the few levers it could pull without direct diplomatic cost. The circumstance that ultimately enabled the family's departure was not the resolution of any negotiation, but the collapse of the political system that had been holding them in place. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in terminal institutional crisis. The economy had been failing for years. The political authority of the Communist Party was fragmenting under the pressure of reform and of the accumulated weight of a system that had stopped being able to sustain its own contradictions. The August 1991 coup attempt, an effort by communist hardliners within the security apparatus to reassert control over the political direction of the country, failed within 72 hours. The plotters misjudged the extent to which the Soviet population and the military were prepared to defend a system they no longer believed in. The coup's failure accelerated the processes of political disintegration that would culminate in the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. In the institutional chaos that followed the failed coup, the organizational resources and coherence required to sustain pressure on the Gordievsky family could not be maintained. In September 1991, Leila and her daughters were permitted to leave. They traveled to the United Kingdom. Maria was approximately 19 years old. Anna was approximately 16. They had spent 6 years living with the consequences of decisions they had not made and could not have influenced. The reunion with Gordievsky was not straightforwardly restorative. He had spent 6 years in the United Kingdom building the particular life of a defector turned public intelligence commentator, writing, consulting, speaking about KGB operations and Soviet foreign intelligence, establishing himself in the relatively narrow world of Cold War intelligence analysis. He had built the structures of a daily existence in his adopted country, defined largely by what he had done and who he had been. Leila had spent 6 years managing alone in Moscow, under circumstances that had imposed practical hardship, alongside the sustained psychological demand of understanding, in retrospect, the full nature of the marriage she had believed herself to be living. The 17 years she had spent building a life alongside Oleg Gordievsky now required complete reinterpretation in the light of what she now knew about who he had been during those years. That reinterpretation was not a task that could be completed quickly, or comfortably, or perhaps at all. The marriage did not survive the reunion in any functional sense. By the mid-1990s, Gordievsky and Leila were living separately in the United Kingdom. The legal formalization of their separation followed. The family that had appeared from the outside as an entirely conventional Soviet diplomatic household at Kensington Palace Gardens had been transformed, by choices made more than 20 years before the reunion, into something that bore no resemblance to what it had once looked like from the street below. Aldrich Ames's arrest by the FBI in February 1994, nearly 9 years after his first contact with Soviet handlers, publicly confirmed what Gordievsky and British intelligence had long understood about the source of the 1985 betrayal. Ames pleaded guilty to espionage charges in April 1994 and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The individuals whose identities he had sold to the KGB and who had paid with their freedom or their lives could not be restored to either. Gordievsky had survived. Others had not. Gordievsky continued to live in the United Kingdom under British Security Service protection that took on renewed practical significance as Russian intelligence services, which regarded him as unfinished institutional business rather than a closed Cold War file, demonstrated continued interest in his whereabouts and activities over the following decades. In 2007, he was appointed Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George by the British government, a formal recognition that, given the conventions of the intelligence world, represented an unusually public acknowledgement of a contribution that could not be fully described in the citation accompanying the honor. He has continued into his 80s to speak and write about the KGB, Russian intelligence operations, and the Cold War, remaining a presence in the commentary world surrounding a history he helped to shape. The broader question raised by the Gordievsky case, the question that serious consideration of any Cold War intelligence operation eventually arrives at, is what it means that decisions made by individuals inside vast ideological systems produced consequences that distributed themselves so unevenly across the lives of people who had varying degrees of agency in the original decision. From the perspective of intelligence value, the assessment is relatively clear. 11 years of access to the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate from inside its senior ranks produced intelligence that warned Western governments about Soviet threat perceptions severe enough to risk dangerous miscalculation, contributed to the arrest of a Western intelligence officer before he could cause further damage, and ultimately enabled the identification and neutralization of more than 200 Soviet intelligence officers across the Western world. The institutions that benefited have assessed it, in the partial accounts they have been willing to provide, as the most consequential human intelligence relationship the Western alliance maintained against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If that assessment is accurate, the strategic significance of Gordievsky's contribution is difficult to overstate. From the perspective of the human cost distributed across the people closest to the center of the operation, the assessment is less clear and less comfortable. Gordievsky made his choices deliberately, over years, with full awareness that the consequences of exposure would be severe, and that those consequences would not fall only on himself. He built a marriage and a family in circumstances that made both hostage to his choices. Layla spent 17 years married to a man who was also conducting an intelligence relationship she was entirely excluded from, then 6 years as a hostage to what that relationship turned out to be, then the remainder of her adult life working through the implications of both. Maria and Anna spent the years between 10 and 16 and 13 and 19 in a country that had turned on their family because of what their father had done, years that could not be returned to them, and experiences that could not be undone by any subsequent reunion or explanation. The Soviet intelligence officers expelled from Western capitals went home to careers and families of their own, carrying the institutional consequence of an exposure whose full source they were not told about. They adapted, as people in such situations do, and continued their lives. The intelligence services that employed them reconstituted their Western operations over the following years, deploying new personnel, developing new assets, pursuing the same objectives through different people. The Cold War that had created the conditions for all of it ended within 6 years of Gordievsky's exfiltration. The Soviet Union, whose intelligence service he had spent 11 years working against from within, ceased to exist in December 1991. Oleg Gordievsky was 36 years old when he made a formal commitment in the autumn of 1974 to provide intelligence against the organization that employed him. He was 47 years old when a cipher telegram arrived at his office in London and informed him in the indirect language of institutional communication, that what he had been doing for 11 years had been discovered. He was 47 when he crossed the Finnish border in the trunk of a British diplomatic car with his wife and daughters in Moscow and no way to tell them where he was going or when he was coming back. He was into his 80s when he continued to speak and write about the choices he had made and the world in which he had made them. In between, he had helped reshape the intelligence landscape of the Cold War, exposed more than 200 Soviet intelligence officers across the Western world, and contributed to what the services he worked for regard as one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the 20th century. He had also lost his marriage, his country, his daughter's adolescence, and the ordinary life that his wife had believed, for 17 years, that she was building alongside him. The cipher telegram that arrived at Kensington Palace Gardens on the afternoon of May 17, 1985, captured the moment when 11 years of sustained deception began to unravel. But telegrams capture only surfaces, the visible transmission of institutional decisions, not the weight of what those decisions mean to the specific people through whose lives they travel. The Cold War was sustained by thousands of such decisions, made by individuals inside vast competing systems, distributed across the lives of people who inhabited those systems at varying distances from the center and with varying degrees of choice about whether they were there at all. The intelligence assessments, expulsion lists, and diplomatic notes are the visible record. What the record cannot contain is held in the private knowledge of the people who lived it, in the experiences of a woman who spent 17 years beside a man she did not fully know, in the years of 2 daughters who grew up in the shadow of a secret they had never been told, and in the understanding of a man who spent the second half of his long life knowing precisely what his choices had cost and unable, in any honest reckoning, to fully separate what he had gained from what he had taken.